Hello watch enthusiasts! When we look at a watch, it's a given that we'll look at the movement with wonder and fascination as a multitude of parts operate seamlessly to provide the 86,400 seconds in each day. Naturally, movements vary radically from the most elaborately complicated examples of watchmaking to some of the more simple and utilitarian examples. However, regardless of the functions of a movement, we're immediately captivated by the sheer detailing on its surface or throughout it. Therefore, I would today like to discuss and explain the different finishes seen on a movement and the level of detailing you can expect from a given watch price range in the process. This will also extend to the grading of movements for finishing, where different brands offer different finishes for different models in their range. However, before I begin the video, I would like to encourage you to like, share and subscribe if you enjoy this video or find the content useful or interesting when you're next looking for a watch, or indeed looking simply at the movement. Also, to see additional watch-related content which would not appear on the channel, such as meetings with other individuals, watch sightings during my daily life, or simply video previews, do follow me on Instagram at the address which is now on the screen. First of all, I'd like to speak about movement surface finishing, but whether it's a decorated ETA movement or a JLC master control, it's very important to identify the different processes being conducted by a brand to finish the movement itself. But to understand that, I really must start with the materials used by each brand. And the basic appearance of movement is defined by the material chosen for the bridges, plates and wheels, an aspect which varies from brand to brand. For most watch movements, ignoring the materials chosen for some specific parts, which can be steel or other alloys, the majority of plates and bridges are made from brass, which can then be nickel plated to give an attractive colour. This coating also is important for preventing corrosion to the surface of the movement over time, and explains why some older movements show a golden surface where the parts have worn. This is very much the traditional approach, and it has been found that this is a perfectly suitable material for movements from a few £100s to many thousands of pounds. This surface can be machined to produce a wide array of different patterns, such as those which I'll mention later in the video. However, there are some outliers as far as movement plates go, often from these most illustrious and in fact expensive brands. For A. Lange & Söhne, German silver is the material of choice for their finishing. And curiously, and rather counterintuitively, German silver, or nickel silver as it's also known, is not a form of silver at all, but an alloy of nickel, zinc and copper. The beauty of this material is that it will develop a warm silver-like patina over time due to its untreated and unplated surface, but it is also difficult to work with due to the risk of discoloration during the production process. Another material which provides the requisite softness for plate production and finishing is gold. This is famously used by F.P. Journe for his remarkable array of movements, and was historically used by Patek Philippe for movements made for specific, designated and highly demanding dealers and customers. Of course, gold provides the ultimate level of lustre, but without some of the subtlety of the aforementioned finishes, whilst also being prohibitively expensive for most brands to use for their movements, and really does appear as a display piece, you could say, for watches where you're really going to be paying attention to the aesthetics of the mechanism. And the softness of the material allows for extensive decoration, and its very nature prevents corrosion to a large extent which would damage the interior of the movement, which is crucial, especially with this used by F.P. Journe for this very particular and rather old-fashioned style of watchmaking, you could say. And naturally there are other materials, such as stainless steel for some automatic winding parts, and of course new alloys and composites, such as silicon parts and even some ceramics in certain movements, in order to resist magnetism or extensive wear. But these are generally seen within the inner workings of movement in order to facilitate the function on a daily basis that the movement will have to go through, rather than being based on the finishing and the general build of a movement. And so, for discussing finishes, one really does have to talk about the various varieties of different surfaces which you can get on these plates and parts, and so I'll go through those throughout this video before speaking about a few other aspects later on. In truth, most movements are not actually given any deliberate finishing, as their surface is left undecorated due to there being no need at an affordable price. You may see this on stock ETA or Sellita movements, as finishes are sometimes not specified by the buyer of the movement, and so there really is no requirement to add it at the additional expense of the manufacturer. Now there are some movements, it should be noted, which do come with a certain base decoration, like for example the Miyota 9015 comes with a certain amount of decoration on the main visible areas of the movement, but nonetheless this is a very rudimentary levels, and most of the movement is left undecorated. And this gives the appearance of a matted and dull finish, which may have visual imperfections where the surface of the metal is not quite flat. And this can be plated in some cases and examples, where the surface is given a colour due to being plated but still isn't finished, at lower price ranges to try and keep the costs down. The first and perhaps most well-known finish is Geneva striping, or Côtes de Genève, which is seen in stripes across the surface of a movement plate. These are stripes formed from individual wave-like scratches, which can be achieved with a number of different methods, ranging from automated CNC methods to mechanically rotating discs guided by hand, or a purely manual process with an abrasive tool. Côtes de Genève also have a sibling in the form of fausse côte, a similar process, but this time in rings on the surface of the movement, as is seen on certain omega movements, for example, in recent years. It should be noted that due to the irregular nature of the pattern, due to requiring an uneven surface to achieve the effect, this is a form of decoration reserved for the outer parts of a movement, and not the inner workings, due to the complications caused by having an uneven surface to the inside of a movement. A finish which is used throughout a well-finished movement is perlage, a process of creating small interlocking circles on the surface of the metal. This is achieved with a small tipped rotating tool which is abrasive to create these interlocking circles which give a neat and ordered appearance which does appear machined like one would see on larger scale machinery, except here produced to a very, very high standard and a very neat manner within the movement. Now less material is removed from this process, thus allowing it to be used on more busy areas of the movement with moving parts within them. So one often sees this between plates or on the base plate of a movement, from which all of the other components are pinned, or at least propped up, you could say. And so this allows a certain amount of decoration in areas which would be difficult to reach with other finishes, but still prevent there from being any visible unfinished areas within the movement, which could pose a problem for the visual aesthetics, especially of a high-end luxury piece. A finish which is often seen on the outer fringes of a movement, but rarely mentioned, is the Colimaçon, a series of lines originating at a central point and curving gently outwards. This process gives a snailed appearance, and is a finish often seen on the top of certain cogs on movements to give an interesting and very dynamic appearance in terms of finishing, and can be performed with a diamond edge tool to give a deeper finish often seen around the very edge of a movement. For example, if you look at a decorated Salita movement, you will often see the very edge of the movement finished with this Colimaçon sort of pattern, but with much deeper engravings thanks to a diamond-tipped tool. And this is a pattern which is often confused, you could say, with fausse côte, because both of them can share this turning appearance. However, whereas on fausse côte you get individual lines which form a stripe, on this you get lines which continue the full length of the pattern, thus creating this sort of semi-brushed appearance, which is so typical of this particular type of finishing. Yet this is a type of finishing which is not terribly well spoken about, because it's not seen in large quantities on large bridges, but rather it does tend to be seen on individual cogs or wheels. Some manufacturers, such as Panerai, choose a more simple but nonetheless delicate finish for their movements. This can be called many names, such as graining, brushing, or an Adoucie finish, depending upon whether it's used as a final finish or as a stage in creating another surface texture. It's achieved by producing very fine parallel lines in the surface of the metal, as will be done with the outside of a brushed case, except of course in this particular scenario, in this application, it's produced on a much finer level due to the fact that you're dealing with flat planes rather than the curvature of a case, whilst also having the fact that this isn't going to have to be exposed to the elements, thus allowing even greater finesse. And this creates a somewhat matted but still very lustrous appearance if caught with light and finished properly, and so it gives a finish which is less precious than more traditional methods, but still gives a certain degree of sophistication, with a slightly more utilitarian appearance, and which doesn't appear quite so delicate as other more traditional finishes such as a guilloche pattern, for example. Whilst perhaps a loose term, polishing is a key component of a well-finished movement, yet the most important variety is black polishing. Interestingly, to achieve this finish, the area must first be brushed with the same method as an Adoucie finish, hence this term meaning in French to soften, as a result of this being the preparation required for further polishing of a movement component. The component is then polished for long periods of time with abrasive compounds until a perfectly smooth finish is achieved, thus giving a black appearance when the light does not hit the surface absolutely squarely, due to the surface being absolutely flat and not having any sort of minor angles which could reflect light if there's not a direct light source. And so the result is quite remarkable, and something which you really won't see beyond the realms of high horology in more affordable pieces, because of the sheer amount of expertise and time required to create a finish of this nature. But if you are able to access a piece of this sort of type, and you're able to look at these sorts of finishes on hammers, for example, within a movement, you really can begin to witness just how wonderful this finishing can be. Engraving is perhaps the closest a craftsman can get to the finish of a movement due to the completely unmechanically defined appearance of this finish. This is achieved with an absolutely steady hand and extreme experience due to the risk of both making an error and writing off the part entirely, which may have taken immense periods of time to prepare. Remarkably, a preconceived design is not often used, thus allowing the craftsman to design the decoration as they proceed with the piece. Perhaps the most often seen example of engraving is on the balance cock of any Elang & Zurner, yet many brands do offer this finishing on select pieces, and indeed some watch cases are engraved as well, which takes another level of skill as well, due to the nature of the material used, the amount of material used as well, requiring absolute care to avoid any sort of slight error. And this is achieved with a variety of different tools, but most of all this takes extremely long periods of time and an enormous amount of experience to achieve to a successful level. A finish which is easy to miss with a casual glance is Anglage, a process by which a watchmaker will polish the bevels or chamfers on the edges of bridges, plates or even wheels within a movement. This requires immense care in order to achieve the highest level of polishing, which can take the form of polishing in areas no current machine could reach, such as in tightly constricted corners. The shape of the polishing varies from watch to watch, as some choose a more difficult curved bevel over the standard flat variety, though both, it must be said, require incredible expertise. The tools used here are often extremely fine, with a polishing compound and even wooden tools used, because of the sheer softness you need, and the level of abrasion being incredibly low to remove very, very small amounts of material. And considering the level of attention needed, it's perhaps unsurprising that this is often regarded as the pinnacle of finishing on a watch, despite actually being quite a minor element in terms of the amount of real estate it takes up on a watch. Although it must be said that the addition of beautifully polished bevels and Anglage is a real wonder to look at. Skeletonisation, whilst not really a finish, is something to consider in this video due to its entirely aesthetic function. However, Skeletonisation comes in a wide variety of methods and techniques, though these are usually defined by price. At the absolute bottom of the range for this process, one finds movements where the components have been fabricated with holes and decoration already stamped into them. This gives a rough finish which does achieve the objective, but does leave quite a lot to be desired, and I must admit, for my personal preference, I would rather have movement without this sort of process than managed or tried to be achieved at a low budget with a poor finish. But moving up into the low thousands, one finds electrospark erosion, a process which allows watch brands to cut chunks out of movement plates without the hours of work normally needed. And this would of course be prohibitively expensive and thus moves them towards electrospark erosion as an interesting alternative. However, if well finished, for example if you see say a Chrono-Swiss, this can be an extremely pleasing option, because as long as the rest of the movement has been decorated well and the edges and bevels have been decorated nicely, then the fact that this process has been used is by no means a bad thing and does make this kind of finish much more accessible. The highest level is that which is used by the likes of Breguet and Patek Philippe, where the movement is entirely hollowed out, with hand tools thus creating a number of mechanical obstacles. Firstly, the movement requires a very strategic placement of support with its very fine metal tracery in order to avoid the movement from falling apart, and in order to hold all of the pivots and points which are defined within the movement, which would normally be protected by full plates, to function correctly and remain in place. Secondly, every new edge and corner requires Anglage, and I think I've already made clear the skill which is needed for that. Before I draw towards the end of this video, there is one last element which I feel needs to be addressed, and that is the grade of finishing seen on a movement, as just as some animals are more equal than others, so are some movements. Naturally, a watch priced at £1,000 will not have the same grade of finishing as a £100,000 watch, even if the finishes are of the same styles. However, it's also important to remember that price can be somewhat misleading, thus warranting examination of a watch very closely before considering it, or indeed asking a watchmaker for further information about a movement. And this is the case with, for example, Patek Philippe and Elang & Zurner. Patek chooses not to standardise their finishing as they use 4 different grades across their range, with popular steel models such as the Nautilus and Aquanaut sitting further down the order of finishing level. By contrast, Lange chooses to have a single and immensely high standard across their entire range, from their entry-level Saxonia to a Datograph Perpetual priced at €120,000. And so this does show that there are variations in terms of the way different brands approach finishing. And whilst I say this, I don't mean by any stretch that Patek Philippe are producing a bad watch in the form of the Nautilus, for instance. However, it is worth understanding that the finishing isn't to the same standard as the Grandmaster Chime, for example, with regards to its movement, which is finished to a truly incredible level. But I will now conclude the video. But I'm very curious to hear what you have to say about these various finishes, and your experiences with regards to what you think looks best, and also which brands you think have the best finished movements, which I'm always interested to hear, because it is such a subjective aspect. And if you enjoyed this video, then do please like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more videos and content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is I'm on the Watch Guy, out.